I believe it was the Carolina Hurricanes that said it perfectly on Wednesday. The preseason only counts if you win. It doesn't count if you lose. Just how much investment do you have in these games for regulars if they have a good or bad preseason?
Not a whole lot, to be honest with you. I'm more looking at the guys that you feel like still have something to prove. And there are some regular guys that definitely have something to prove. But I think these games are really important in the sense of, especially for the Rangers where they're at right now, there's not a whole lot of roster competition. I've said this repeatedly now. I think 21 of the 22 spots on the roster are pretty much set. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a competition for who that 13th forward is going to be. Johnny Brodzinski, Alex Belzile, Riley Nash. I think those are the names in the mix there. But what I'm really watching for is the lineup combinations, because Laviolette has been open about wanting to experiment and look at different things. And he has been true to his word there as well. We've seen a lot of different combinations. For example, the first day of practice kind of opened everybody's eyes wide to see the D pairs that we're used to seeing split up, where you had Adam Fox playing with Keandre Miller and Jacob Trouba with Ryan Lindgren. Well, then the next 4 or 5 days after that, they went back to the usual pairs, Fox, Lindgren, Miller, Trouba. But now tonight on Thursday against the Devils, it looks like we're going to see Fox and Miller again. So for me, like seeing them try out different things like that, seeing if they might find something in the preseason that will then stick for the regular season, that's where I'm interested. And that's kind of what I'm watching closely. I think it's really interesting for the forward combinations right now. The top line, it looks to me like he's really leaning toward Kreider, Zibanejad, and Lafreniere. And I think the fourth line, we've seen a pretty good indication of what Laviolette wants to do there. And he really liked the game the other night that Barclay Goodrow, Nick Bonino, and Tyler Pitlick had together. I think the questions are in that middle six range. What's the second line going to look like? What's the third line going to look like? Will Philip Hedl, who's out right now, going to miss a few days, but it sounds like it won't be very long before he's back. Will he get a chance to play on that second line with Artemi Panarin? That's something I'm really intrigued about. Where does Capo Caco fit in? Where does Blake Wheeler fit in? So these are sort of the questions that I have on my mind going into these preseason games, more so than the results of the games. And of course, I'm interested in watching the young guys. Will Cooley, I think right now is really making a good impression on Peter Laviolette because he continues to give him pretty prime opportunities. I'm convinced that among the prospects, he might not be the highest ranked, but he's the guy that they think is closest to being NHL ready and should get an opportunity, maybe not right out of camp, but I think at some point this season. Obviously, Brennan Othmann is a guy I'm watching closely. So guys like that, Zach Jones, Matthew Robertson, some of these young guys who you're curious about their development. Those are sort of the long list of things that I think I'm watching for in these preseason games.
Well, when you talk about line shuffling, I know over the last 2 years, a lot of was made about Gerard Gallant maybe trying to shuffle lines and immediately going back to what was already put in place. Do you feel like Laviolette could do that during the regular season? Obviously, shifting lines during the preseason is one thing, but do you feel like in the regular season, once we get there, it's more these are your lines, or that there will be some experiments?
To be determined. I would not be surprised at all if early in the season you see a variety of different combinations, but I did sense from being in the locker room every day last season, there was an underbelly of frustration with the players about how frequently the lines were being changed. You'd hear guys make comments like, oh, well, you never know. It's probably going to look different tomorrow. And I heard from a couple guys who sounded like they weren't crazy about how frequently it was happening. I think early on in the season, they can stomach it and they understand we're trying different things. We have to see what works best. But last year, it felt like the entire season, they were constantly being changed. And I felt like there was never a chance given to really develop chemistry in some of those situations. Lafreniere is a perfect example. For short little stints, they would try him at right wing, but they never really gave him a long runway to go through the growing pains and sort of figure it out. And I think Laviolette seems more determined to do that. He said today that when it comes to the 5-on-5 lines and also when it comes to the power play, that right now he's looking at a lot of different things. But by the time we get to next week, when the Rangers have those final 2 preseason games next week on Wednesday and Thursday, he said that's going to look a lot more like what he's thinking he's going to want going into the regular season. So I think that what you see coming out of camp and at the end of camp will probably be what we see to start the regular season. And he'll try to give those lines a runway. But of course, injuries happen, underperformance happens. There's all kinds of different factors that could lead to changes. The one thing I would say is that I think the players would all benefit from, and probably if you ask them to answer, you honestly enjoy, is if they didn't change quite as much as they did last season.
Gotcha. And you mentioned some of the younger guys. The one guy that really kind of made a name for himself on Tuesday was Matt Rempe. Just, do you feel he's got some sort of role with this team, or is this just him battling in the preseason?
He's not going to make the NHL team. He's going to play for Hartford this season for sure. He's a long shot guy. Now, we do this big project every summer where we rank the top 10 prospects in the organization. I poll all different kinds of scouts and executives and people who have opinions on these sorts of things to put that list together. And Rempe's certainly not a guy that got any consideration for the top 10. He's a guy that if he carves at any kind of a role, it's going to be a fourth line type of guy. He skates pretty well for his size. There's not a ton of skill there, but he's going to be a guy who brings toughness. You see that he's willing to fight. I think it definitely made a good impression in the locker room that when there was a situation where Ross Johnston was clearly looking to fight somebody, that of all the guys who were playing the other night, it was one of the youngest guys there in Rempe who was willing to answer the bell. And so that certainly goes a long way, not only with your teammates, but I also think the coaching staff takes notice of things like that. But as far as Rempe being a real NHL player for the Rangers this season, he's pretty far down, I think, on the list of guys who could play into that role. Eventually, could he get a look as a fourth line bruiser, as a guy who can bring size and skate a little bit and defend and play with some grit? Maybe, but there's actually a few guys in the organization like that. Adam Edstrom is another one of those guys, doesn't fight like Rempe does, but a lot of other similar characteristics. They're both like 6'7", 6'8". So the Rangers like to invest those late round draft picks in some of those bigger guys and see if they can hit on some of them. And they do like Rempe. Obviously, they have him here in camp and he's going to play for Hartford this season, but he's certainly not a guy I would think is going to make this roster.